Okay, this is the last lecture on globalization. I will discuss the assignment for this at the end of this lecture on the two books we're going to talk about today. The first book is How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Ford, which we will talk about. The other book we're going to talk about today is The Lexus and the Olive Tree by Thomas Friedman. So, those are the two books we're going to talk about today and kind of tie up globalization at the end of this presentation on those two books. I will go over the assignment for you and expectations of the assignment. So stay tuned for that at the end of this lecture. So let's start with How Soccer Explains the World by Franklin Ford. So just briefly, Franklin Ford is a writer and author and thinker. He's written for websites like Slate and the New Republic and others. He is a huge fan of soccer. Never played except for when he was a little kid, but he has taken a book. He's taken a book where he wants to talk about globalization, and he uses soccer as the metaphor to talk about globalization. So we'll start with his book. It's really an attempt to use this global game of soccer to explain and understand and explore globalization. So again, remembering back to your packet that talks about globalization as a process, and a process that has been in use and has been prevalent for centuries. Um, Keeping that in mind, we see where Franklin Ford is coming from. He's going to take soccer, which is truly a global game. Every country in the world has some sort of professional soccer league, and they want obviously the best players in their league, and there are financial consequences to winning and losing. And there are people who, obviously because of migration, have traveled around the globe, but their home team is always whatever. And so soccer truly is a sport that transcends boundaries. So it's a really good starting point to think about globalization. So that's where Franklin Ford is kind of starting from, right? And he in his book, it's a 10 chapter book, he kind of ranges from Brazil to the United Kingdom to Iran um, to Ukraine. He talks about tribal tensions, whether it be religious tribal tensions in Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics, whether it be ethno-tribal tensions, like in the Ukraine, when Nigerians recently, many Nigerians have been being recruited to play in the Ukrainian league. Um, Whether it's that tribalism, um, whether that's kind of part one of the book, the globalization that erodes ancient hatreds. So, um, take as the example of that these two teams in Ireland, the Rangers and the Celtics. The Celtics are a Catholic team, and the Rangers are the Protestant team. And of course, in their early stages in the development of those two teams, that was very much the truth. And very much, if you were a fan of the Rangers, you were Protestant, the players were Protestant, and that was the ethos of the team, right? That was how the team was constructed around that identity. And of course, then in Ireland, the Protestants and Catholics did not like each other. And so these two teams represented that hatred. Uh, Obvious now, we're talking, 2010, 2015, 2021, the players on those teams don't understand those ancient hatreds. They're not part of that. You have, for instance, on the Celtic team, you have a striker who I think is from the Ivory Coast, West African country. You have um, players who are from around the globe and do not understand that hatred. And you have people like me who are Protestant but who really like the Celtic team. So there is no animosity really anymore. And so how globalization has eroded that is Franklin Ford's first part of this book. Now, that's not to say that it's been always successful in eroding those ancient hatreds, because part two of the book then kind of explores how, in erasing those, have been consequences, have been fallouts. And so, one of the things he looks at is the English hooligans, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. But kind of the consequences of what happens when globalization enters onto the soccer pitch. And then the end of the book is really how he believes that soccer can bring out the best of all of us, that soccer can be a metaphor for um, having, to use the phrase about soccer, the beautiful game. It can be something that is beautiful for all of us. And so it can, again, he ends the book saying that it can blunt tribalism, that it can really bring out the best of us. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the themes. So you're just not coming at this cold. You have some background as you read the chapter that you're supposed to read for today. So again, as I said, the first part of the book is really about violence and tribalism. And he brings up these three. These are three different chapters in the beginning of the book. Red Star is a team in Serbia. Of course, at the height of the Serbian War in the 90s, there was all kinds of ethnic tensions between the Serbs and the Muslims and the Croatians, and that was just led to war. A man took over. A man took over this team, the Red Star Belgrade team, and has really had used it as a political arm to suppress his rivals, his political and ethnic rivals, and they would be they would employ a lot of violent tactics, and were seen as an arm of the man who owned the team. They were seen as an arm of ethnic cleansing because they would only attack people who were not in the tribe, were not in the group. What was interesting about that, and I just want to sort of share a bit of that, right? Because it's interesting in terms of how it points out globalization. So that these men, and they were men in the Red Star Brigade, which is what they called themselves, modeled themselves after foreigners they admired, especially the Western European hooligans. Hooligans is the word that is used to describe violent soccer fans. Um, the name Ultra Bad Boys was ripped off from Italian supporter clubs. Another club called itself the Red Devils after the British club Manchester United's nickname. In the late 80s and early 90s, the Red Star hooligans would go to the British Cultural Center in downtown Belgrade to scan the papers for the latest antics of English hooligans. The Serb hooligans also paid tribute with their fashion. This is important to hear. The Serb hooligans also paid tribute with their fashion. They wore Adidas tracksuits, gold chains, and white leather sneakers, just like the crazed fans they read about on the other side of the continent. Of course, the genealogy of this aesthetic had other roots than England. It borrowed heavily from African American gangster rap, a favorite genre of Serbia youth. So just in that paragraph, you see what Franklin Ford is telling us, right? Here's a group of Serbian ethno ethno-tribal men who have been displaced because of globalism, who have lost their jobs, been downsized, and are frustrated with the global market, with the way this process of globalization is panning out. It's cost them their identity. Yet then all of a sudden their identity their fashion identity is heavily reliant on the look of the 1980s and 90s gangster rap in the United States. Their showing of who they are, their identity of violence, is based actually more on England and Italy and other Western European countries. So even though they're frustrated by this process that downsized them, they can't escape it, right? And they're even it's not as if they're aware that they're doing these things, right? It's not they. This is a layer of globalization that is below their consciousness. Um, as Franklin Ford says, their disdain for globalization was hypocritical, right? Now, not overtly hypocritical, but it was illogical, right? They were borrowing from all these other cultures their fashion and their identity, when in fact, and what they were really railing against was um, the very globalization that had downsized them. So that's kind of the first part of the book. You see similar things with the story about Chelsea hooligans who are techno wizards Monday through Friday, and then Saturday they shave their heads and they go out and they literally beat people to near death, who are in another tribe who pull for Arsenal or whatever other team they're up against. And but they're very refined about it. They put on suits and they only they only behave in a certain way, but it's still violent, and it still stems from the fact that they feel threatened by this process of globalization. So in the next part of the book, Franklin Ford talks a lot about the corruption that comes from this um, process of globalization in soccer. And one of those things is he looks particularly at Brazilian soccer clubs, where Brazil is in many consider to be sort of the heart of soccer. It's not where soccer originated, but if you want to see beautiful soccer, if you want to see soccer that moves you, that is played like poetry, then Brazil is the soccer that you would watch. And the league in Brazil is so corrupt and so mismanaged, as to be killing the game. No self-respecting player wants to play in the Brazilian league. Uh, it's likely that they may not even get paid because the teams are so mismanaged. Hardly any team, if any team, is operating in the positive in terms of their financial windfall in this professional soccer league. But the other part is just Nigerians playing in Ukraine, which I mentioned earlier. And then they kind of he talks also about this new wealth that has been created in the latter half of the 20th century, and how a lot of times this new wealth can be tied to the idea of nationalism and ethnocentric behavior. And they buy teams to sort of shield and give themselves a front of, see, I own a soccer team. I can't be a racist. I own a soccer team. I can't be a nationalist. And so he talks about that some in this chapter as well. But what all of those things really do is just exploit the worst tendencies of globalization, allow people to exploit the worst tendencies of globalization. The chapter about the Ukrainian soccer league, there's a Nigerian that Franklin Ford follows around in the Ukraine. And of course, in the Ukraine, there are 4 months in the year where they can't play soccer because the ground is just frozen. It's just a totally different climate than what Nigerians are used to. And not only that, but Africans in Nigeria are a relatively new thing. The Ukraine even having sort of a liberal democratic government is a relatively new thing. And so to have those two things happening in quick succession is disorienting for Ukrainians, and it has heightened racism in Ukraine and increased nationalism, as they're like, well, the money that we spend on Nigerian players, we could spend on improving Ukrainian players here. And again, Franklin Ford's point is maybe, but Nigerian players play a different kind of soccer, which most people would argue is more entertaining to begin with. So these are all sorts of conversations he's having here. He ends this unit, this part of the book, talking about transitioning into the power of soccer in this globalized world. And he ends with Iran, which is a theocracy and pretty repressive when it comes to women's rights. But that, and I don't remember the date, and you don't need to remember the date at this point, but just that was a period in the turn of the century where women, through soccer, were granted voice and agency in that country. Generally, women wouldn't be able to go to football games, go to soccer games, and they found a voice and agency during the Green Revolution, and were able to soccer was the vehicle through which they were able to claim some stake in society. So he kind of ends with that note right there on that. And then the last part of this book that I want to spend a little bit of time on is the part you'll be reading. You're reading chapter 10, and it talks about how soccer explains American cultural wars. And if you think about soccer in this country, you realize that it is played by the educated middle class, which is different than every other country in the world, right? In every other country in the world, soccer is the lower working class. So that inverts the structure of soccer, and it kind of pits red versus blue. If you listen to people, particularly when I was growing up, when you listen to people on ESPN, soccer is a socialist sport. Soccer is that old European trash sport. Well, 0-0 tie is boring, etc. They would constantly rip soccer and elevate baseball or elevate football, American football, and in so doing, try to point out American exceptionalism. We're exceptional because baseball. We're exceptional because football. But what is really going on here is a kind of a subtle dig about globalization, according to Franklin Ford. According to Franklin Ford, what really is kind of happening, and you'll be looking for this theme in the chapter that you read. Be looking for this kind of red versus blue, this rural versus urban, this educated versus working class. Be looking for these themes as you read chapter 10. Be thinking about how our society talks about soccer, right? He quotes Jack Kemp, who was an American politician for many, many decades back in the late 1900s. And Jack Kemp is basically saying that soccer is useless, right? But no value in soccer. And so, but as you read why he says that, kind of it highlights these ideas I'm wanting you to think about. He ends with the idea that globalization can lead to violence, as he has laid out. And it can be violent or lead to violence, but it can also be peaceful and helpful. That really, as we get a grip on what globalization is, and as we really live in this new world, then we can really benefit from globalization. And that transitions into the Thomas Friedman book, right? The Lexus and the Olive Tree. And what he's really saying is that the world is really only 10 years old. That is he wrote this in 1991. I'm sorry, 1999. All right, he wrote this in 1999. So when he says the world is only 10 years old, what he's referencing is the fall of the Soviet Union almost 10 years earlier, right? That prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, you had the United States democracy and communism, the Soviet Union, and it was two sides fighting over the chessboard, right? And everyone understood Communism bad, democracy good. And it was dualism. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, right, there's no longer duality. And what is really then seen as that capitalism won, democracy won. Hallelujah, democracy won. That was an article that we were going to read, we may read later in the semester, called The End of History. And in that article, the author talks about this exact same event, this event of no longer having two competing ideologies. The ideology of democracy and capitalism won. So that's what he's saying. That's what he's spending some time talking about. And he's saying, it's really unusual because here was his grandmother in the mid-90s playing bridge with people in France or other countries, right? And how unusual that his 70 or 80-year-old grandmother was sitting here playing bridge with people in Europe. And that's the power of globalization and the internet. And it happened that quickly, right? It happened almost overnight. The Soviet Union collapses and this new dawn of globalization emerges. So, in this new dawn of globalization, it's more like 100-meter sprint. It used to be sumo wrestlers. When it was U.S. and Russia, Soviet Union, it was sumo wrestlers. Everyone knew the two sumo wrestlers. But now it's a 100-meter sprint. And every country is involved. And you're all competing. And no one wants to lose the race. Because if you lose, first of all, you don't know who you lose to because there's so many people competing. But if you lose, it also threatens your identity, which, again, this is all Franklin Foer is talking about, is identity. These two books are heavily linked. So the idea that if you lose the race to an unknown entity, then your very identity as an American, if soccer becomes more popular than baseball, that threatens my very identity as an American. I cannot tolerate that. And so that's Thomas Friedman here trying to get us to think about how quickly things move, and you've got to always be moving to try to win this race. Otherwise, it could threaten your very, very sense of identity. So we have to retrain ourselves, right? We have to retrain ourselves to this speed that is happening within globalization, right? To think about, he wrote this book in 1999. But in 1990, most people didn't have email, didn't have cell phone, right? And I grew up in that, right? I was in high school at the beginning of the 90s. I had no email. I had no cell phone, right? I was almost done with college before I was even on the internet. But by the time I was in graduate school in the late 90s, the internet was well established, and I had a cell phone. And so within a decade, so much changed in terms of what people had access to, right? So to sort of understand and explain globalization in a two-pronged approach, there's information arbitrage. In other words, you have to identify trends before they happen. What's going to be the next thing? And how can we get access to the information and then get to synthesize it? So in other words, the first part of this approach is trying to stay ahead of that race. You got to stay ahead of that 100-meter race. You got to identify what trend is next. Cell phones are going to be the next thing. Let's get on cell phones. How can we make them better? How can we make them bigger? How can we make them take more pictures? How can we do this? How can we do that? How can we get that? And that's that information part of it. That's like having the access to information, but then take the information and kind of piece it together into a helpful medium, right? And then the other thing, and this is what he says we don't do well enough necessarily, is to tell the stories. We do not tell the stories of how we get the information, why the information is important. We don't tell our own stories. We all have stories. Maybe a person doesn't like soccer for some reason. Tell the story, right? Because the trend is that soccer's coming, right? Soccer is growing in popularity. Well, let's explain that trend, why it's happening, and then let's tell each other stories about it. And let's be able to hear and listen to those stories. And is the trick, right? Hearing a story and listening to the story are two different things. Can you hear a story and listen to a story, process a story? Those are very different things. So then finally, in this book, and you're going to be reading chapter 3 in this book, that's just kind of a sense of when you lose that race, you're losing your personal identity. And so that becomes a problem. But here is where that problem can blossom. So Japan builds Lexuses, right? And a Lexus is built almost entirely by robots, right? And it represents our quest to modernize. It represents that part of humankind that wants to always push forward, always wants to move forward and discover and build and create. But then there are olive trees, and olive trees are beautiful, and they're deep rooted trees that keep us rooted to our tribes. So these are the two tectonic forces that pull at us, a desire to modernize, and really in this age of globalization, a need to modernize, a need to grow, but also the deep roots of an olive tree that keep us grounded in our tribes. And they're constantly at war with each other, constantly battling each other. And so the way to minimize this war, because we can't end it, it's always going to be there. There is no way to end this war. It's always present. But the best way to mitigate it, the best way to limit its adverse impact is to accumulate information, right? And more importantly, synthesize that information into a sustainable and balanced relationship, right? So not just get information. Getting information is good, but you have to do something with it. And when you get that information, whatever that information is, right, to synthesize it, to bring it together, to put it together into a sustainable and balanced relationship. And that's the best way to do that. So as you read chapter 3, kind of keep an eye out for those themes. Keep an eye out for how the olive tree and the Lexus, how that tension can be balanced, how we can gain the information and synthesize the information, um, whatever that information may be. So kind of keep an eye out for that theme as you read that chapter. So, okay, quick pause here for a second, and we're going to talk a little bit about the assignment. Okay, so this is your final assignment, and it is a multi-paragraph essay. Don't ask me what multi-paragraph is. You know what multi-paragraph is. I don't want ridiculous questions about it, right? So, using all of the readings, lectures, and slides, create a clear and concise understanding of globalization. What is it? How does it work? Why does it matter? What are your feelings about globalization? Notice all of those kinds of what is, how it works, why it matters, what you're feeling about it. All of those things need to be incorporated in your multi-paragraph essay. But once you've developed that and those things, what it is, how it works, why it matters, what you're feeling about it, those 4 things represent your idea, right? All 4 of those things must be present in your idea of globalization. I hope that's clear. You're then going to do at least 2 paragraphs. I said at least 2 paragraphs where you use everything we've discussed, everything you've read in these 2 books, everything from the Millennium Development Goals, everything from the packet that we did the first week we came back. Anything and everything we have used as talking about globalization are your resources to construct at least 2 paragraphs to buttress and support your claim about globalization. Whatever your idea of globalization is, however you answered those 4 things, right? You then have resources to say, this is why I believe this, because of Millennium Development Goal 1, eradicating poverty, it's da 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 da, right? And when Franklin Forrest said this, it made sense in lieu of what I said about this. So this should take 2 full paragraphs for a total of 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs is a minimum. 3 paragraphs is a minimum. So you've read several things on globalization. You've reviewed the 8 Millennium Development Goals. These are the things that should be included as evidence, right? Use this stuff as evidence. If you turn in 1 paragraph to me, it's like 3 sentences. Globalization is a process. I love it. I've got nothing for you. Okay, so this assignment is posted in Schoology. You'll see it alongside this lecture and the readings. But as always, if you have questions or comments, you may email me, and I'll be glad to help. Hope you have a good week.